And I'll try to keep in with the comments as well. Hey, there we go. We are, welcome everyone. We are live. Welcome to the Discussing Disease here with Rev War Revelry. I'm Phil Greenwald, and I'm joined here. I'm going to go left to right around my screen with ERW stalwart historian Mark Malloy. Down in the left corner is Vanessa Smiley, who's joining us, a glutton for punishment, coming back to discuss disease here, and also making her debut and sullying her reputation as the backbone of the Prince William Historic Division, Paige Backus, who gave a great talk on Civil War medicine, which will be going live on YouTube. If you're also a follower of ECW, pay attention to that access code coming up soon. So welcome everyone. We have our alcoholic refreshments, because that's what's needed when you're talking 18th century medicine. Obviously we're all worried about this one pandemic, so let's stop worrying about the 21st century. We'll walk back into the 18th century. So we'll get Paige to kick it off with some of the broader themes about disease during the Revolutionary period.
Sure, thank you, Phil. Well, it's interesting to compare everything that's going on now to what was going on during the American Revolution, because a lot of the theories that we now know today just weren't existent back in the 1700s. For example, everyone now today is making sure to wash your hands or use hand sanitizer, wear face masks, wear face shields, stay apart from one another. But a lot of that knowledge and a lot of that those ideas of what caused disease and bacteriology were just not around back during the American Revolution. Pretty much the main train of thought that was taking place in colonial America were a couple of different theories. Theories known as, the main one was the humor theory. And the humor theory was that you had 4 different elements that were all in balance. And when you were healthy, those were all in balance. And those different humors were yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood. And if you were sick, if you had a fever and you were hot, that meant your blood was out of balance. If you were sick and if you were throwing up, that meant your phlegm, or excuse me, that your yellow bile was out of balance. If you were sick and you had diarrhea, that meant your black phlegm was out, your black bile was out of balance. And so pretty much the way that they were working to try and cure these diseases, the main things that you would find would be things like bleeding and purging, which we'll go into later on part in this discussion. But as a part of this as well, another theory that everyone kind of focused on during the colonial era, and one that everyone kind of followed, was called the Boerhaave theory. And that was that the body had 3 different conditions. One was salty, one was putrid, and one was oily. And if the body experienced any of these different kinds of feelings, being hot, salty, oily, that was another indication that you were sick as well. And connecting to the humor theory, if you were any one of those things, if you were oily, you would purge that oil. If you were salty, you would try and purge that as well. And so a lot of what was going on during the colonial period was not to the standards that we are used to today. And the study of medicine itself was actually really limited during this time period, because if you think about what people go and learn in medical colleges today, you have clinicals, you have observations, you have book work, you have dissections. But back during the colonial era, dissecting the human body was actually considered, not only was it illegal in many cases, it was also thought of more of the body was sacred. And so you were actually going against God, essentially, if you were dissecting a human being. And so there were some rare cases where they were called anatomists, who study anatomy, these physicians who would go and try and study some of these bodies. And you could study bodies if they were unclaimed, meaning they were someone either died homeless, in debt, no one claimed the body. But because it was so limited, this is where you start seeing an increase in body snatching and things like that over the course of the 1700s. And it's even taking place over the course of the American Revolution. But I mean, a lot of these surgeons, a lot of these doctors that are operating during the American Revolution, if you think about it, only went to about 2 years of medical school and then consisted of an apprenticeship where they were following another doctor who learned an apprenticeship from somewhere else. really at this point in time in colonial America, you really only have two medical schools, one in Philadelphia and one in New York, that are actually pretty decent medical schools. A lot of the other medical schools that are around at this point are in Europe, in Paris and in Scotland are two of the big main ones. And so just the knowledge that these medical personnel are getting during the colonial era is, again, just not to the standards that we are used to. And so as we go throughout our discussion today, I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to medical stuff with gross and interesting facts that kind of come in. So as you guys are talking about the different periods over the course of the American Revolution, I'll toss in some of those nasty curveballs and things like that as we go throughout our talk today.
I don't know really where we go off from there. We already talked about bile and excrement and all that. And it's so I guess maybe we go to enlighten about maybe smallpox inoculations. Let's just jump into the number one killer of American soldiers during the Revolution. So Vanessa, I know you were eager to scratch that itch.
Nice use of that term. I was, although, yeah, the bile and all that stuff, that's what we came here for, right? Well, the smallpox, you're right. Smallpox was pretty serious at the time. And so right at the beginning of the war, you have 1775 in Boston, the fall, winter of 1775. That's kind of the first time that the Continental Army is really dealing with the threat of smallpox. The British were not quite as worried because for the British, inoculations were pretty consistent and they were encouraged. It was a policy that was in place for most of the war. But for the Continentals, it was not quite a consistent policy at that point in time. There were a lot of concerns with the fact that the idea of inoculation, a lot of concerns regarding that. For example, to do any sort of inoculations means that you're actually giving, in this case, soldiers, you would actually be giving them smallpox. Yes, you're hoping that it's a mild case and they'll recover, because once you got smallpox, you were immune to it for life. So once you got it once and you recovered, you never got it again. But if they start inoculating a large body of people and that escapes and gets into the civilian population, you could actually have a pretty massive outbreak and a possible epidemic, depending on where the inoculations are taking place. So George Washington is not jumping at the bit to try to inoculate the troops yet. Washington himself had smallpox as a younger man, and so he was immune to it by that point in time since he had survived the disease. But by the time Boston's being ravaged with it, Washington's just not ready to make that commitment to inoculations. Now, the difference between inoculations and vaccinations, I was trying to look this up because I used to know all of this information in the back of my brain somewhere. Vaccination is different. Vaccinations weren't kind of determined or discovered or put in use until after the Rev War. I think Paige can correct me, I think in the early 1800s.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, okay, I got it. And so with vaccinations, it's introducing either a weakened or a dead virus, pathogen, whatever. And so your body exhibits a much smaller immune response, but your body builds those antibodies it needs to fight off if you get infected or you get exposed to the disease again. Inoculation is basically like, here's a live organism, virus, whatever, good luck, hope you survive. And that's a very simplification of a very, very big simplification of it, but that's the main difference. So this at the time of the Rev War, this is basically taking scrapings of the blood and pus and all that stuff from pustules of smallpox, from smallpox victims who are actively trying to fight this disease, taking the healthy person, doing an incision, typically on like, I think the leg, because it was further away from like your main, organs and everything. And in basically taking that pus and other stuff and putting it in that incision and being like, all right, let's hope you survive this. So George Washington knows that inoculations could be very important. In fact, I think Martha gets inoculated in May of 76. So she gets inoculated, but he's not ready to take that leap until 1777. In January of 1777, he and the Continental Army are making their way into Morristown for their first encampment in Morristown. And the disease has started to ramp up again because it's winter. It starts to pass through the soldiers currently in the army. And that's when he pulls the trigger on it and says, okay, let's go ahead and start inoculating all the new recruits, because we cannot risk losing significant portions of our army to this disease through death. Now, granted, inoculations, there's going to be a recovery period. So during that time when the soldiers are trying to fight off infection and hopefully survive, and most did. I should repeat that, even though this was could be very dangerous, I think it's like 1 or 2% died from the inoculation. So considering that smallpox has a 30% death rate at the time, that was really good odds for the Continental Army. So Washington doesn't have use of his troops that got inoculated for several weeks while they recover. So an encampment time frame is generally the best time to be able to do that, because he's not in desperate need of all of his troops. So that's the very short summary of smallpox and the inoculations. Now, from Morristown, the inoculation policy for the Continental Army does spread. It goes to Philadelphia, it goes down to the Carolinas, up in like Connecticut, basically wherever there were large chunks of the Continental Army or large chunks of soldiers encamped together, that's where they would be able to do the inoculations. Yes, there were civilian deaths from the inoculations in Morristown in 77. There was, I think, about 70 civilians who died. And that's probably about 10% of the population of Morristown at the time. So that's pretty significant. But those that survived it are immune for life. And so that's what George Washington was banking on. So that way he could save his army should smallpox run rampant again. And one final note I'll say is that there were rumors that the British had actually encouraged during the smallpox ravaging Boston in 75. They actually thought the British were releasing the disease on their enemies at that point in time, but there's no real evidence that suggests that.
That's a good point. Because it even comes real quick, Mara, and then we'll jump to you because I want to get a George Washington thing in before we give it to the George Washington scholar.
Yeah. Well, I have a funny smallpox story too. I want to tell.
Funny. So we got
This is great.
So first, of course, you are right. Martha does get inoculated in 1776. Washington gets inoculated, but he's already immune to it because he does have it in Barbados. And there was actually a study going out because there was some issue about the whole father of the country couldn't father his own children. They actually said that almost 12% of the 800 patients that were studied in this medical study had sterility issues. So it's quite possible that maybe Washington, because they did it between 18 and 20, I think, 2-year-olds. So, I mean, obviously the study's 300 years later, but humankind and so forth. So it's quite possible that smallpox saved Washington for the purpose needed during the Revolution, but also helped ruin the chance of Washington having children himself. And then also on the civilian side, I want to throw out one of the places I used to work, Thomas Stone National Historic Site, one of America's smallest national parks. Thomas Stone's wife actually was inoculated during the Revolutionary period, and actually when she had complications of it, they gave her mercury as a treatment, and so she ingested the mercury, which ended up killing her. And Thomas Stone actually followed her to the grave 6 months later, due, they said, to a broken heart. So smallpox leads to the death of one of Maryland's 4 signers of the Declaration of Independence. But just an interesting, notes about smallpox, how it led to Washington, how it led to the inoculation, of course, of the Army. So who wants to go? Mark or Paige?
I wanted to pick one. I thought that was a great summary, Vanessa. And I think that, a lot of scholars would say that Washington's decision to inoculate the Army was a major turning point in the war, because had he not had the smallpox infested the army at some point, it could have, especially during the campaigning season, it could have totally changed the history of the Revolution. And to Phil's point too. Oh, and also, I mean, well, you talked about how they would actually do it. There's a great scene in the John Adams miniseries where they show that. And I was actually an extra in the John Adams miniseries when they were filming down. I was going to school at William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. And when we were the extras, we were waiting in line to, get makeup and stuff like that. And they picked out a couple of people at random to make smallpox victims. When they came out of makeup, I mean, they just covered their entire face with these pustules, and it was disgusting looking at and knowing it was fake. I just can't imagine having a disease like that is as deadly as it is. And the disfigurement and stuff like that too, because Washington apparently carried scars from his smallpox his whole life. And Phil mentions Washington possibly not being able to have children because of smallpox. Well, that also may have helped save the entire country as well, because one of the things about Washington is because he had no children, there was no possibility of a aristocracy, a line of Washingtons going on to always rule America or whatever. So in the end, that turned out to probably be a benefit long term for the Republic. So, but very great. But anyways, I want to hear Paige's cool smallpox.
Yeah, gross us out, Paige.
Yeah, I don't want to say that smallpox is fun, but with everything with the pustules that are formed over the course of smallpox, what ends up happening is they scab over. The scabs fall off, kind of like chicken pox, and then that's where you also get some of that scarring from. And so as inoculations became more and more widespread, doctors and surgeons actually started collecting those scabs, and they would keep them in little tin containers so that when they would go around to the countryside, they could actually do inoculations without having people who are infected with smallpox right then and there. And so there's a couple of places here on the East Coast that have some really amazing medical collections, and they were both formed in the 19th century, but I promise this connects back to the colonial era. One is the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, and one is the Army Medical Museum, now the National Museum of Health and Medicine, just outside of Washington, D.C. And I was at a medical conference a couple of years ago, and the director of the Mutter Museum, Dr. Woolrich, was telling us a story about how the museum had just acquired one of those smallpox tins. And he had it on his desk, and he opened it up, and all of these smallpox scabs fell out onto his desk. And so the whole place had to get shut down. The CDC had to get called and be brought in to clear the museum to make sure that there was no smallpox cells live, because that could start a whole other pandemic. Fortunately, they were all dead, but it was just interesting that, I mean, you just have all of these scabs falling all over your desk. CDC has to come in, swipe, and clear the whole building. And it's kind of like that scene in Monsters, Inc., where everybody's just coming from the ceilings to just clear the whole area.
I mean, both those museums too are fantastic, but do not eat lunch before you go there.
Yes, you have to have a strong stomach.
And I think Dale Dooley, a friend of mine who worked with my wife at Congressional Cemetery, we went to it was called a death salon that was up at the Mutter Museum up in Philadelphia, which is really interesting. And it was just looking at all the different collections they have, including these different diseases. But one of the people who helped set that up was the College of Physicians in Philadelphia there, that was started in part by Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a major medical person in colonial America, and he was in Philadelphia. And I think it's also really interesting just to talk about some of these doctors. You mentioned there weren't many medical schools, but they were doctors, but then they also played additional roles. So like Dr. Benjamin Rush is also going to be signer of the Declaration of Independence and take a very active civic role. And then in the Army too, you have doctors like Hugh Mercer, he studied over in Scotland, and he's going to end up being killed at the Battle of Princeton. And you have other ones who join up in the army. So I just thought it was interesting that you have all these doctors who are working on this, are doing additional stuff in addition to fighting disease. So.
Right, including Dr. Jean Coste, who was actually a French physician under Rochambeau, who actually turned William and Mary into a hospital during Yorktown.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we used to have, I think, ghost stories over there. Some of the French soldiers who were treated there during that time period.
I mean, that's we have one of our patriots on ERW that's doing the comment today. So he threw out a question. So we often hear the advances in medicine during and after the Civil War. Are there any equivalent examples from the Revolutionary War? One of the things that did advance is actually just battlefield surgery. I mean, you think about these surgeons and everything not having just practice, and suddenly they're facing at their time a multitude of casualties coming in. I mean, the musket ball wounds and so forth, ones that are moving slow enough to break bone, but not fast enough maybe to penetrate all the way through. And actually, they said 65% of, or 35% of ones who went through amputations actually survived, which might shock people because you hear about, I mean, how bad medicine is. But I mean, there are not obviously the advances that happened in the Civil War. I mean, the casualties are less. There's less surgeons. There's less accounts left over. We've already talked about Dr. Rush and then Hugh Mercer and those ones. One of the ones that usually gets overlooked is one that actually, and always mispronounce his first name, Albigence Waldo, who leaves a great account at the Valley Forge encampment and so forth. And one of the things that he remarks, and a few of them do, that today we realize that would have been a big precursor to collecting, to spreading disease, is that there's such a dearth of clothing for Continental soldiers at Valley Forge that when soldiers went into the hospitals, when there were hospitals, or into the barracks they used, sometimes their clothes were confiscated, and if they passed away, those clothes were then redistributed to soldiers that were considered healthy in the encampment. So that soldier could have gone in carrying who knows what. Obviously, he's sick with something going in. They never understood that those clothing options may have transferred the disease and so forth. Later on, we hear at Yorktown that what Cornwallis may have left African Americans or other implements, clothing, etc., that for during warfare, which is one of the things that is pushed around. But it's the clothing, and then obviously the lack of fresh fruit or fresh vegetables and so forth that leads to scurvy and other ailments. So, but yeah, Albigence Waldo leaves a great account, great diary of Valley Forge. And one of the interesting things is that he thinks, he writes in his diary that soldiers may be healthy because they're not going to be living outdoors. So actually coming in cramped conditions might actually help the soldier survive because they'll be able to gather heat and so forth instead of being out in the open. Now we know actually that fresh air and so forth is betterment. And then last thing I'll add, and then I'll pass it on. I want a neat little story that actually comes from the, I hate to be the first one to mention Civil War, even though it was already commented, but there's actually in one of the manuals for officers, volunteer officers in the Civil War, and it probably held true to the Revolutionary War, said that the coffee tastes better when the latrines were dug downriver instead of upriver. So just a sign there that even the placement, some things we take for common knowledge wasn't so common when you're facing somebody what is considered a large army, when you really didn't have a large army and an administration of creating everything from scratch for the Continental Forces, a medical department, a quartermaster department. Everything's got to come together quickly. And at the same time, you are fighting the British, who are kind of maybe the biggest empire in the world at the time. So who have these things structured already. And so the Americans are trying to copy or emulate that as much as possible on the fly, which goes, but anybody else know of any advancements during the Revolutionary War or anything you want to throw out?
I don't know about advancements, but I do want to, you talked about, just to compare Civil War and Revolutionary War. I always think this is amazing is the fact that you mentioned amputations, which are going to happen a lot with battlefield wounds and things like that, musket balls in arms or legs or whatever. Usually, especially with the muskets they're using during the Revolutionary War. I mean, you're talking 69, 75 caliber musket balls, round balls that are, you know, dull lead. So they pretty much expand once they hit you. They've done some experiments where they fire, you know, into, you know, meat just to like see the ballistics, basically what happens. And when you get hit with one of these musket balls, you know, it expands. So the exit wounds are usually pretty large compared to the entry wounds. So it just does like massive damage and splinters whatever bone it hits. So yeah, so usually they're doing amputation, but the amazing thing that it just blows my mind is thinking that, you know, during the Civil War, most of the amputations they're doing, they're able to knock people out, you know, so they're not conscious when these amputations are happening, whereas there is none of that for the Revolutionary War. So every amputation that's happening during the Revolution, the person is conscious and aware of what's going on. So they're, you know, that's where, you know, they have a piece of leather or whatever they just have to, you know, bite down on while they saw off their limb, which is just amazing to think that anybody could survive that and what that would be like. You know, you'd almost rather die than wind up in one of these battlefield hospitals or whatever. But I just think that's interesting because you go to the Civil War Museum of Medicine and things like that, and a lot of times they repeat that 90% of all these, you know, because typically in the movies they show the person screaming and yelling while they're sawing off their arm and leg, and you know that didn't happen as much during the Civil War, but it did happen all the time during the Revolution. So I think it's important to realize that when you hear about, oh, at the Battle of Trenton, you know, only 20 Hessians were killed, but 80 were wounded, and it's like you think that the wounded, most of them are going to be, you know, be able to be taken. I mean, that's almost worse because, like I said, they're going to be having a pretty awful attempts to be recovered or whatever with the medical practices at that time.
And showing the medical practice, going back to the place Vanessa and I have both worked at, Morristown, there's when it does open, there's an awesome exhibit inside the museum there of some of the tools used by the surgeons. And one of them is actually the one where they grab the artery and would pull the instrument used there. But before we do move on, I did talk about that area of New Jersey, Basking Ridge. There's a great comment from Robert Ryan, who talks about one of the advancements of Dr. James Tilton, who actually invented the idea of the field triage hospital. So, and there's a great comment that folks can read on this live stream there. So thanks, Robert, for passing that on to us. But Paige is shaking her head, so I think.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to mention, because Tilton, after the Revolution, actually did write a book called The Economical Observations on the Military Hospitals and the Preventions and Cure of Disease incident to an army. So that was really kind of the big text that came about after the American Revolution that really kind of focused on the sanitation methods, that he was actually really impressed with the French methods of cleaning out and rotating the straw and bedding 2 or 3 times a week, using spring water instead of well water, things of that nature. And that is also, it's digitized and it's online. So if anybody wants to read it, it's on the National Museum of Health and Medicine's website. You can search it there.
It's amazing they're able to figure some of this stuff out, again, with no germ theory. So like, it's just kind of like trial and error, I guess, that they're finding out some of this stuff. It's, you know, the amount of lack of knowledge that they're trying to, you know, work through is, I mean, it's amazing they're able to be able to do what they are doing. Even though I think a lot of them are, you know, they hurt a lot of the patients more than they'd actually help them in some cases, like the bleeding.
Right. They can figure out that you need to swap your hay twice a week, except when you try and find your bullet wound, you can stick your finger in and fish around for it in there. So.
Well, and even something as simple as, you know, what you're consuming in your home. So when Phil, I think you wrote the post on the blog to announce, you know, our topic for today, you know, beer was a little bit healthier to drink than, say, your average water. They didn't get the concept of germs and disease and, you know, all that stuff that could be in water that is bad for you. But through the natural process of making beer, cider, what have you, they're able, like boiling water, they're able to kill some of those pathogens in there, but they don't know why, but they just know that I don't get as sick when I drink my beer as when I drink water from the nearby creek or whatever. So even something as simple as what they're consuming in their homes at this point in time, civilian and of course any military, they know that some of this stuff, even though today we're like, what? Drinking beer just for no reason? What?
Yeah, well, who drinks beer
it's
for
not.
no reason? They all grab a drink right now.
Yeah, so even something as simple as that, they knew that I don't get as sick when I drink this or consume that, but when I consume this other thing, I get sicker, so I'm not going to do that.
And then also just, I mean, one thing that's out is the demographics too about, I mean, your first time you have a lot of people from the northern colonies meeting people from the southern colonies, and then claim this, I know working at George Washington birthplace, it was known a little bit that you only took baths maybe once, twice, 3 times a year, and the saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, literally meant, hopefully you could still see the youngest person in the bathwater when all the rest went through. And that building up the dirt and stuff, sometimes they believed it was a protective shield or whatnot. So some of these farm remedies, and I mean, that's one of the things I think you espouse in that other war that happens in the 1860s, is that with all these people come together, you have farm hands or farm boys meeting city dwellers. Well, you still have that a little bit in the Revolution, but you have Bostonians meeting people from the Carolinas and so forth as well. And just the transmission of ideas, thoughts, disease, etc. So just wanted to throw it out that the Rev War did it first, bringing people together. That other war just made it more popular. So,
well, the comparison between the two wars, I mean, it is on a much smaller scale with the Revolutionary War, but I think percentage-wise, probably, I haven't looked at the actual numbers, but I think it would be probably similar to the amount of people who are dying of disease at these different encampments and stuff compared to a lot of the Civil War armies as well, because it is a similar thing where people are coming together who hadn't normally done that before. So, yeah. And, bringing all these guys together and all these people dying, during the Civil War, you had all these commissions that were set up to try and deal with the dead, and how you're going to deal with the massive amounts of death and stuff like that. During the Revolution, they didn't really have any sort of infrastructure or anything. So when Vanessa's talking about Morristown, a large percentage of the population, running out, it was up to just whoever was left to go in there and bury the dead. And that was something else they were trying to figure out too, is people who died of disease or whatever. What do you they're handling the bodies and things like that. I think through trial and error, they also figured out that you have to bury them pretty quickly. But that's something, and Phil, right at Valley Forge, they were burying the dead outside of the encampment because, they didn't want, they thought that there could be noxious fumes or something that could cause disease among the living. So.
True. And I mean, even, and then most believe that, hey, the climate obviously as well. And it was a shock to some that, I mean, like they were still many suffering into May and June of 1778 before the army departs Valley Forge, that there are still men getting sick and dying and so forth. What is amazing though about the death and disease and tying in Valley Forge and Morristown to make, I know he's probably not watching, but Eric Olson would love this, the historian at Morristown National Historic Park. Is that the reason that Valley Forge is known is that was the trial and error of all the sickness and health and organization of how to even structure the cabins, how to clear those streams. By the time they got to Morristown, just 1 year later, just showing how much the Army had grown and the less amount of casualties due to death. Now, yeah, there's still men that died, and there's naturally going to be, because especially in the Continental Army, you have people coming and going. And I think that's something that should be thrown out, is that in the Civil War, yeah, you had recruits, or you had 2-year enlistments or 90-day enlistments, but the bulk of the Army was there for from 61 to 64, where in the Revolutionary War, it takes a few years for the Continental Army to finally say, for Washington to get approved, that these guys should be there for the duration. So for this first few years, you're getting men that maybe build up immunity, they go home, new ones come in, then you're having them face things like, do you do inoculations yearly? Do you, they got to trim the excess off those units, because those are the weak ones that are going to succumb to things. So that's another difference between the encampments, Valley Forge and Morristown, but also the makeup of the Army itself, the people that are coming. And a lot of times after the initial part of the war, it's the dregs of society that they're pulling, like in Maryland, they're pulling people out of debtor's prison, wayward people, and so forth. So you're attracting even those that might be picking up something from home and bringing it in next to the Army. So.
And I think it's important to point out that, yeah, we're kind of comparing apples and oranges when it comes to Rev War and Civil War, because there are certainly major advancements made in medicine and treating disease during the Civil War. But during the American Revolution, we're trying to figure everything out from scratch in terms of how to run an army, how to protect an army against not just, the British, your enemy, but disease. They didn't have a war department, like a medical war department until right at the beginning of the war. It's the Army Medical Department. And it was just kind of a hodgepodge of doctors that didn't necessarily have any military experience that are trying to put together the foundation of what this medical department is going to be and how we're going to treat and heal soldiers, whether it's from wounds or whether it's from disease. So Rev War, we're trying to start it all up, just to get it up off the ground. That's why it's such a big deal that they learn so much, for example, at Valley Forge, because they're still trying to figure out how do we put together this, this encampment in a way that's healthy. So they're getting a lot of help from those that have done that before. Von Steuben obviously does a huge amount in just helping train the troops. But they're having to break ground on everything American. Whereas by the time you get to the Civil War, you've got all that kind of stuff in place. So they're not only just trying to deal with what's coming their way, they're trying to do it without really anything to help them out except what they may have studied themselves. I mean, obviously we're learning a whole lot from the British, and we want to learn a whole lot from the British, but we're also trying to make it our way, not the British way. So they're having to overcome that obstacle on top of everything else.
They just drank more beer, they would have been okay, right, Vanessa?
Right? That's what I'm saying.
I mean, and throwing out there, if you have the chance to read up, there's a new biography that came out on Dr. Benjamin Rush and some of the work that he does further on, including something I know Mark wants to talk about here in a few minutes, the yellow fever epidemics. But even not only in that, but in the mental health field as well. He studies some of that in Philadelphia, and they have one of the first institutes or so forth that allows them to have fresh air and so forth, and kind of humanizes them a little bit instead of pushing them away. Of course, Rush falls, and I'm surprised that Mark wants to mention them and then talk about Washington, because Rush kind of falls out with George, but I guess Mark is spreading his wings a little bit here. So you want to talk a little bit of yellow fever?
Well, I think it's interesting just to see, what we're talking about too is, how these armies are dealing with disease spreading from, these groups of people that came together. And like Phil said, I just wrote a blog post for Emerging Revolutionary War about the yellow fever epidemic in 1793. So a few years after the war is over, during Washington's first presidency, and it struck the capital of the United States, which was Philadelphia. And looking for, and in this time of COVID or whatever, looking historically how people dealt with epidemics or whatever, and the yellow fever one that struck Philadelphia was really deadly and pretty interesting to read about. Basically, and yellow fever is different than other diseases in that it's spread by mosquitoes. And basically, a group of people were coming from the Caribbean, and they land in Philadelphia, and all of a sudden it starts outbreaking in the summer of 1793. In fact, one of the first deaths was somebody who was in, was living with the Washingtons at the president's house there in Philadelphia, and she dies. And then basically it starts spreading through the city, and a lot of, the city at that time was about 50,000 people. And people start evacuating the city in mass, but a lot of people couldn't evacuate, and then other towns start blocking people from getting into, putting up roadblocks and things like that to try and stop people from getting into their towns, because they know that yellow fever has broken out in Philadelphia, and it starts getting worse and worse. At the beginning, in the early part of the fall, something like 20 people a day are dying from the disease, and it's a pretty horrific disease, because when you get yellow fever, it starts, it works very quickly in your system, and basically gets its name yellow fever because you start getting jaundice and turning yellow. and then he started basically bleeding from everywhere and vomiting black blood, and it was about like 50% of the people who got yellow fever ended up dying from it. So it was a pretty awful way to die. And then by October of 1793, something like 100 people a day are dying of this disease. And it's and what's amazing is people like Benjamin Rush and things like that. And yeah, politically, I have some qualms with his viewpoints. And medically speaking, he was an adamant believer in bleeding. As we were talking about the four humors theory, which even then was being questioned. Some people weren't sure if that was actually the right way to go, but Rush believed it, and he even though it was incorrect based on our knowledge now, it was still amazing the bravery he had going into these neighborhoods and things like that, where they're just devastated by the disease and risking their lives. Many of these doctors to try and aid the people who are sick. You can see the picture behind me, Stephen Gerrard of Philadelphia carrying some of the sick people because they were trying to get them to a hospital outside the town. But it was just a devastating disease. And over the course, and of course, once it got cold, the mosquitoes died off and it ended the plague. But they didn't know that at the time. And so they were doing all sorts of preventative measures because they thought it was in the air. So they were wearing masks with vinegar in them, trying to keep clean air. They would try and stay away, social distance from people. And they would also, they had fires burning in the middle of the streets, trying to get the smoke to get it out. It's just amazing to try and think not knowing. And then the personal lives that it affected. I think one of the really sad stories was future First Lady Dolly Madison. At that time, she was married to John Todd, who died from the yellow fever, and then both his parents died from the yellow fever, and her child, the baby, died from yellow fever as well. So she pretty much lost a lot of her family all in the matter of like 2 weeks or whatever. So it's just start thinking about the human toll of all this. And over the course of the pandemic, the epidemic of 1793, over the course of just those few months, almost 5,000 people died from yellow fever, just 10% of Philadelphia. And they were filling up graveyards. In fact, Washington Square Park was filled to the brim. They filled up every single spot and closed down the cemetery and moved on to another place to start burying people. So it was pretty devastating story, but interesting to see how people dealt with that, and then how they, Washington had to temporarily go to a different White House in Germantown, but it eventually goes back to life as normal in Philadelphia. I just think these people, dealing with these kind of diseases, I just see how stressful it is right now for a lot of people during COVID. I mean, I can't imagine every day not being sure if you're going to catch smallpox, yellow fever, all these terrible, awful diseases with high mortality rates. This is just kind of life for a lot of people back then. So,
one of the silver linings, if you're a Washington deceased or a Washingtonian or a Northern Virginian, is that doesn't the yellow fever play a part in the movement of the capital? Most people believe that it will just end up in Philadelphia and stay there, but he's in yellow fever, if I'm not incorrect here, help precipitate that move toward a more mosquito-filled area. So kind of interesting. Let's move away from Philadelphia. It's too sickly. Let's go right into a very wetland area on the banks of swamp. A swamp. Sorry, I have anytime someone says swamp, I've been fighting the last 5 years in Everglades National Park that it's not a swamp. So the word swamp just kind of makes me like shudder a little bit. So I also don't want any connection that we're calling DC a swamp today. We're talking 1790s that it was a swamp at that time. So just throwing it out there. But and then of course, even in Washington, even before that, talking about sickness. I mean, he is they believe very close to death, even in New York City. And he's sick enough that they actually will put straw and stuff outside of his house on the road to muffle the sounds of wagons going by because of how sick Washington is. And then this big burly man, right, Mark, gets a sore throat and dies in 1799, right?
Yeah. Yeah, he dies December 14th, 1799, a couple days before. It's interesting. They say, he was riding around Mount Vernon, gets snow on his hair, and starts getting a little tickle in his throat, I guess, starts coughing, wakes up in the middle of the night and is really having trouble breathing. And they end up sending for 3 different doctors. And Dr. James Craik, somebody was asking on the comment feed, who's a famous doctor. Dan Welch was asking who's a famous doctor other than Rush. I think Dr. James Craik is probably one of the most famous. He was, a surgeon that was with Washington throughout the French and Indian War. He was also with Washington throughout the Revolutionary War, and he was his personal physician. He was, and he'd be by his bedside when he died. And Washington was also a believer in the idea of bleeding. He's actually going to have one of the overseers at Mount Vernon start bleeding him. And then eventually when the doctors get there, they bleed him more and more to the point where they end up bleeding 5 pints of blood out of George Washington while he's laying there. Just gives you an idea of how much blood they took out of him, which of course didn't do anything but weaken his state. And he's kept getting worse and worse in his throat. And basically what was happening was his throat was swelling up to basically he was suffocating to death. Washington said, famously, "I die hard, but I'm not afraid to go." And at one point, one of the doctors was actually talking about potentially performing a tracheotomy on him, which was a brand new kind of idea. But then when they conferenced and they were like, when the news gets out that they cut the president's throat and that led to his death, they realized that it's way too risky. So they might have saved him, but I don't know. So anyways, they cut, so they don't do the tracheotomy. And Washington eventually says, basically leave me alone. And it's not until 10:15 on December 14th when Washington finally says his last words, "'Tis well," and passed away.
And of course, bleeding. We have a comment here, so we'll make the connection between the bleeding of Washington to throw this one off the page. Someone is dying to know if you know a good leeching or bleeding story, Paige.
So there's, well, I don't mess with leeches because those things are nasty. But there's actually, when looking at all of the different tools of what is used to go and bleed patients, you have things like thumb lancets. You have my favorite tool, which I highly have you go and Google it, is called a Scorificator. Has anyone here on the panel actually heard of a Scorificator before?
No.
So a Scorificator was a medical tool that was used during the colonial era, and it is a little box that's maybe about 2 inches by 2 inches. And in that little box are 16 little blades that are spring loaded. So they would take the Scorificator, put it on somebody's arms over a bleeding bowl, and then they would trigger that switch. And then it would put those 16 blades in at once into your arm over your arteries. So Google what a Scorificator looks like. And that is one of the creepiest tools that would have ever been used, even worse than trephination or the procedure that Mark was talking about. I mean, getting blood drawn today is terrible for a lot of us to think about. Just imagine 16 cuts on a spring-loaded little box.
No, thanks. I'll just die. Thanks. Yeah.
I like the name, though. It just sounds gruesome. It also sounds like an amazing Scrabble word if you throw it out there. You could actually spell it. So a lot of people are going to be trying to Google how to spell whatever that word is, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce. But all right, so as we near the end of this, I would say, lively discussion of bloodletting and pus and so forth, anybody have one last endearing story? We can do a little round robin. Most gruesome thing, interesting tale, anything from the hospitals or bloodshed, war, etc. Anybody open-ended or anything related to the topic. Mark wants to stop using his burner account to talk about Benjamin Martin for a minute. We can do that.
It's Jeff Black.
Well,
I got a story. I think we talk, especially when we're talking about bleeding and other stuff like that, or the lack of hygiene. you know, it's incriminating on a lot of the medical practice at that time. But there were some positive, you know, I think we often overlook the real positive contributions a lot of these surgeons and doctors were doing. And I mean, it's definitely out of the best intentions. And sometimes, yeah, it didn't work. But I think it's important to realize that sometimes they did do good jobs. And there's a great story that took place at the Battle of Trenton in December 1776. You can read about it all, victory or death. But basically, after Washington crossed the Delaware River, there were civilians, you know, using the roads, and Washington's guys actually capture this one civilian, a Dr. Riker, who's on his way to go see a patient or something, and all the Americans are gathering all the civilians and saying, like, you can't go anywhere because we're marching on Trenton and we're going to attack the Hessians there. And Dr. Riker offers, he says, I would like to go along with you all just in case, you know, you need a doctor. And the men who had captured them were men from the 3rd Virginia Regiment that was raised here in Northern Virginia. And one of the young lieutenants, the 18-year-old James Monroe, and he's in command here. Monroe looks at the doctor, talks to him, and says, okay, yeah, you can come along. Now, as the Americans approach Trenton, once they start getting into the battle, there's a Hessian cannon. Henry Knox says, you know, go get some men and go capture that cannon. James Monroe and a few other guys charge down King Street. The Hessians fire into them. A musket ball hits James Monroe in the shoulder, actually severs an artery, and he falls to the ground and starts bleeding out on King Street there. And sure enough, who's there? Dr. Riker, who had been allowed to follow along with the army. He runs they carry Monroe out of the street, and Dr. Riker quickly clamps his artery and saved his life. And James Monroe survived the battle, obviously. He always had a scar there, and he survived to go on to become the 5th president of the United States. But if it wasn't for the efforts of Dr. Riker, battlefield doctor, he would have passed away there at Trenton in 1776. How would that have changed American history? I don't know.
So yeah, and if you'd want to read more about Trenton, Princeton, I'll do it for Mark. I think there's a great book that's out as well. So that way we hit the triumvirate: Civil War, Benjamin Martin, and Victory or Death. Yeah. I just have one good quote that I forgot to share earlier when we were talking about Valley Forge, and it's great. It's definitely 18th century mindset, because on January 3rd of 1778, this final notice was sent by under the order of George Washington, Commander-in-Chief, probably written by one of his staff officers, but it's directed out to his the regimental surgeons that are there at Valley Forge. And the quote says, or the order says, being informed many men are rendered unfit for duty by the itch, the Commander-in-Chief orders and directs the regimental surgeons to look attentively into this matter, and as soon as the men are affected with this disorder, are properly dispersed in huts to have them anointed for it. So as soon as you have the itch, which probably meant lice or louse or whatever in your, to get them out as quickly as possible. The other good image is that I was talking about earlier, that of course soldiers going to the hospital would have some of their clothes confiscated, and then if they passed away, where the clothes were given to healthy soldiers. Well, they also had the problem that sometimes their clothes were either stolen by healthy soldiers because of lack of garments, but when those people recovered, someone couldn't go back to their encampments because they had literally no clothes to wear out of the hospital. So imagine you survive the hospitals in Valley Forge, and then you go out and you realize someone has stolen your clothes. So now you're literally naked but healthy. And so now they had to actually tell the surgeons to find a safe place to lock up these people's clothes until they were either passed away or are healthy enough and they could get their clothes back. So I mean, I feel like that's great imagery. Like, I survived whatever, I survived the hospitals. Now I need clothes. So can anyone find my pants? So it gives a whole new meaning to serving in tatters and rags. So 2 good images there: the itch and naked guys looking for clothing running around. So, you only get that in the Rev War. So top that, Vanessa.
I don't know if I can top it. I was just trying to look for a quote from Joseph Plum Martin, and he doesn't really give that's gross, but he does say, it's funny you mentioned the itch. He does mention in his book that that when they were inoculated, they had the itch and they just kind of had to deal with it, and they were told, hey, you're getting inoculated, but then you're going to go hang out in your winter quarters and you're going to get over it and it'll be fine. And so I was looking for a really good quote from him because I had marked a bunch of them before today's Zoom, but I don't think I can top what you guys have so far, but I bet Paige can.
Naked men in the itch, Paige. Can you beat naked men in the itch?
Well, the itch can mean a couple of different things depending on what you're talking about, such as the clap can as well. But I won't even go there. But I'm gonna give you guys all a cure. So the next time you guys have a runny nose, there is a cure that is in a publication that was readily available in a colonial America called The Poor Planter's Physician, or Every Man His Own Doctor, because doctors during this time period were so widespread that a lot of the times it was up to these families themselves to try and administer their own herbal medicines and things like that to try and cure their own family members. And so in The Poor Planter's Physician, there is a cure for runny nose. And all the snot that's coming out of your nose and all that nastiness, that is that phlegm and that yellow bile. And so that means you have too much and it needs to be put back into balance. And so a lot of, it's become popular again with athletes. Have you guys all ever seen the athletes using the cupping therapy before? That's an ancient medicine. People have been doing that for millennia, especially in the Chinese medicine and things like that. But in colonial America, those cups are called suppuration cups. And what they would do is, if you had a runny nose, to get rid of that extra phlegm and get rid of that extra yellow bile, they would put it on your skin. They would light a candle around it, and that creates a suction, creating a blister. And once you pull that cup up, once you have that blister, they would cut the blister and all of that phlegm and bile would come out. And then theoretically you would be cured of your runny nose.
All right.
And if
I will
you
not
have
be
a runny
trying
nose,
that.
that means you just do it again until your runny nose goes away or you have no blood left.
Whichever happens first.
So just a disclaimer, ERW does not recommend cupping until you have no more blood, but if you do start the cupping process, we will get you on one of these ERW Zooms. I think we might be the first Revolutionary War dedicated site to show live cupping. As long as you also use the Scarificator or whatever it is.
Scorificator?
Scorificator.
Yeah.
Don't use the Scorificator.
Don't use that. Please don't use the Scarificator on any younger siblings or spouses. But before we wrap up here, if you are interested, we mentioned a few different places that if this stuff excites you or freaks you out or intrigues you, of course, Morristown, the Medicine Museum, if you're going also as well, I guess maybe Prince William has some things you could go possibly see. We'll throw it out there so Paige doesn't get in trouble with her boss.
It's Civil War medicine.
The Civil War, that other war. So, but any final comments? I don't think we can stop runny noses cures, the itch, naked men.
If you want to read about Washington's final illness, definitely read Peter Henrique's He Died as He Lived. It goes into all the kind of like a medical view of the last illness of Washington. So I definitely recommend if you're interested in reading that. And then, as you mentioned, historic sites or museums. The two medical museums that Paige mentioned, the National Museum of Health and Medicine is really, and like I said, they're really interesting and sometimes grotesque, but in the Muter Museum in Philadelphia are both awesome.
There we go. Well, I'd like to thank, of course, Vanessa for coming back. I'd like to thank Paige for letting us rope her into this. She found out yesterday, after she gave an amazing talk on Civil War medicine, that we want to let her leave Stevenson Ridge until she agreed to do this. So thank you for coming on tonight for ERW. Next week, we do change it up slightly. We do an author interview, so stay tuned for that. And then we're back in 2 weeks with talking about the Western theater in the American Revolution. So thank you for tuning in on the Sunday night, the Rev War Revelry. Stay safe. And if you do get that runny nose, please just take medicine. So thank you all.
Don't bleed and purge.